I used to pump up the volume in my high impact aerobics classes in the 1980s in order to blast my aerobics bunnies into bliss. Well, these days my approach is a little gentler, but it's still intense. And now my raison d'etre is to encourage a kind of soul searching or soul inquiry. And my interest now is to raise the intensity level in the practice of a certain level of penetrating attentiveness that allows the soul to appear in all of its fullness, which has to do with you as yourself appearing in all of your splendid plenteousness, and not that you usually imagine yourself to be. I'm interested in seeing you in your direct and immediate felt sense of uniqueness. I'm quoting from Robert Sardella about you appearing in your direct and immediate felt sense of uniqueness, which is not an ego asserting itself. I've no interest in beholding that ego asserting itself with a sense of entitlement and that the world owes me something. Rather, I wish to behold that ensouled being who lives with, again quoting from Robert Sardella, a sense of being given and given at every moment. So this latter way of being, this mode of being, a sense of being given and given at every moment, is living with us in a way that I'm transparent to transcendence. It's living with a sense of gratitude that at every moment, I repeat, there's a sense of being given at every moment. So it's not about the assertion, here I am, but the practiced humility of a sense of being given. You know, when someone's living in this way, with sort of soul shining through, when they smile, they could knock you out. I'm actually speaking right out of direct experience. Somebody smiled, simply smiled at me the other day, and I was overwhelmed. It was really amazing. You think, actually, somebody can give you a nasty look, and you know what that does. But here was a smile that was emerging, I think, from a kind of radiance of being. I mean, I think that this person lives with a sense of feeling that she's being given at every moment, and soul shines through wonderfully and had a huge impact on me. It warmed me inside. I hope I don't lose that warmth ever. Don't want to. So my recommendation is to pump up the volume in your search for soul, like in your search for God. Now, the quest for a deeper inner life or a deep spiritual life can sometimes begin with some small thing or some small event. And this was the case with Borghild Baldauf, who in 1997 was sitting in a small, quiet back room of her home, listening to a monthly radio program on world religions. And she heard about the life-changing experience of Dr. Sarla Kumar, who had experienced spiritual initiation through the Indian scholar saint of Kashmir Shaivism, whose name was Swami Lakshman Jew. Swami Lakshman Jew. Now, there was something in Dr. Sarla Kumar's experience, her evident sincerity, her simplicity, her devotion and joy, that resonated really deeply with Borghild's own searching heart. She knew as she listened to the radio that somehow she would have to respond to this, even though the idea of relating to an Indian guru was completely outside of her background and her experience, outside of her categories. But it was a revelatory moment for Borghild. So she determined at that time to pump up the volume in her search for a spiritual path that she could call her own. Over the next several years, Borghild attended meditation sessions and retreats, and in time she became friends with the scholar of Kashmir Shaivism, whose name is Dr. Bhatima Baumer. At one point, Baumer showed her a photograph of Lakshman Jew, and as Borghild says in response, the master was sitting in samadhi and something indescribable radiated from his appearance. Samadhi is a God-intoxicated state. So this is what she was looking at, this picture of this Indian teacher. A little while later, they were together at an Easter service, and they were at a Russian Orthodox liturgy that was reputed to be so beautiful. And together after the service, Bhima gave her a gift. She gave her a gift of a photograph, a framed photograph of Lakshmanju. Now, when she gave the gift to her, she said, "It's an icon." Well, it happens that Burckhardt had studied iconography and already understood that icons are windows on eternity, or windows on the absolute. And she understood that merely to observe an icon is a superficial act. That if you're going to have a deep relationship with an icon, this involves experiencing the light of transcendence shining through the transparency of the particular saint who is being depicted. So an icon is a vehicle of grace-bestowing power. The light radiating through the saint can purify and light up your life. Now, Burckhardt's response to being given this precious gift was she decided to live with the icon. And, you know, I understand this act of devotion because it was actually quite a few years now, but somebody gave me a gift of a photograph of a guru, Guru Mai Chitvilasananda. I had never done meditation in all my life, and I set up a practice in my home. I put this picture of Guru Mai on a meditation table, and I began a meditation practice. Well, it happens that at that time, my 3 sons were, teenagers, and they were embarrassed that such a room existed in our home. So when friends were over, they made sure to steer them away from this room featuring the photograph of an Indian guru. They were so cool, and apparently I was not. Anyway, the effect of meditating in front of the icon for Burckhardt had a deep impact on her inner life, just as it did on mine in my situation. On one occasion, as she was meditating, she experienced an epiphany of the saint and was overwhelmed by the experience. She was shocked and fearful, but she says in the next moment, immediately Lakshmanju was transformed into light. I mean, this is her testimony of this incredible experience in her life. She says about it, the light dissolved into something indescribable, which was beyond light. Here's a glimpse of Burckhardt's subsequent experience. She talks about the opportunity to spend an unforgettable week in Kashmir together with Bhima, which meant not only, she says, the fulfillment of a long-cherished dream, but put her in touch with a living tradition. So she says, I visited the ashram and felt the still, dense, and concentrated atmosphere there, that peace and intensity, which is always a sign of authenticity. I sat for meditation where his presence, that is the presence of Lakshmanju, seemed condensed to the utmost, and listened to the fervent recitation of ancient hymns. She said all of this was connected with deep inner experiences, and it was like seeds falling on soil, which increasingly was open and ready to receive. So here's her experience. So there were many hours of meditation with Bhima in an inspiring meditation room. And then on the last day of this enriching time, a strange thing occurred. She says, I started weeping, and for hours, there was no end to my tears. Fortunately, I was alone that day because it was as if, for the first time in my life, I had lost control of myself. Completely helpless, I was unable to form a clear idea, lost in the welter of disparate emotions and the vain attempt to get the rudder back into my hands again. There was nothing I could do except go to the meditation room, prostrate myself there, and let go of everything. In the evening, a long and heavy thunderstorm broke off, like the cosmic counterpart to my explosive inner state. So Burkhardt asks what had happened. And her answer was to say that during the night, my former life had passed in a flash. So she looked back on that former life and she recalled how she'd grown up in an atheistic, agnostic family, but that somehow there had always been for her a call. She'd felt an inner attraction to God. Her first communion as a Catholic little girl had been an intense event where she had devoted herself to the Lord. Later, she'd studied theology and for 10 years had worked as a lecturer in an Old Testament department. Now here she was, far from all of that, meditating and weeping at an ashram. She'd entered this foreign world only to find that it was her world. She'd pumped up the volume on her search for God, and here was the result. My former life had passed away in a flash. She'd pumped up the volume in her search for God and was now experiencing a kind of purifying and cleansing state of grace, but connected with the overwhelming sense of grace, of being loved, was a sense also of grief. Wouldn't you know it? Put there together, grace and grief as together there in this opening up process. Robert Sardella has described this level of grieving as a purification of soul life that makes possible the making of the soul as a vessel that can be completely, radically receptive. So in such an experience, he says, every cell of your body cries out in pain. But when we go deeply into this level of grieving, there is a turnaround of soul life, a conversion of soul life. And people who grieve in this way, says Sardella, can't easily, I find this so interesting, can't easily be around a lot of other people, not because they don't like them, but because a purification process is going on that is separating out what is necessary and essential from what is non-essential. And then he makes this point about the consequence or the result of this kind of inner purifying experience of grace and grief. He says the result of this level of grieving is that there is this amazing paradoxical phenomenon that all of the world suddenly becomes alive. The flowers are vivid. The sky is vivid. Why is that the case? Because the soul is now open. He says it's the task of the soul to develop radical receptivity. So he calls this process, what this woman went through, as a movement towards developing the capacity to learn to create love in the world. Wouldn't you know that the step, like the necessary step, in order to be able to love is to experience this deep brokenness, a deep letting go. So it's your great good fortune, and indeed it's the great good fortune of the world, if you find yourself undergoing such a purification or purging process. It's God's gift to you. It's to be welcomed as a great gift. So pump up the volume. You see, I did it one time as an aerobics instructor. Now I'm saying it in different context. Pump up the volume in your search for God. So many other things are not worth the time and attention that we give to them.